Hi there, Kodiak lovers. So when you're trying to take off or land in a strong crosswind, do you find it difficult to track centre line with your wings starting to roll on the takeoff? Or perhaps when you're trying to land, you're finding it difficult to keep aligned on the centre line, and then when your wheels do touch down, you quickly veer off the runway or perhaps end up in a crash. If so, this is the video for you. Hi there, welcome to Alpine Bravo. My name is Brendan and this is my channel for all things Microsoft Flight Simulator. In this video we'll be carrying on with our series of tutorials on how to fly the Dare Kodiak 100 by Submerged Studio, and we'll be looking at crosswind takeoff and landings. This tutorial, unlike quite a lot of the previous ones in the series, is really focused on technique rather than procedure. And you're going to want to make sure that your flight controllers, whatever you use, are well configured. And if you're not sure how to do that, check out part 1 from the series, which goes through how to set that up. You're also going to want to be able to set up custom weather presets to make sure that you get the right kind of wind so you can practice your technique. And we'll just cover quickly now how to do that. So from the world map, you want to select your departure runway and then go to flight conditions. And if you're in live, good idea, go to preset and select, we'll take some scattered clouds and then we can customize that to whatever we want it. And you're going to do that by clicking on this icon here, which will give you the mean ground level winds. So at the minute it's just taking what comes with the preset, and you're going to choose the wind direction. You can either do that by typing it directly into the box here or using this to rotate it round. Now we're going to be using runway 20 at John Wayne, and I could set that to a direct crosswind. If it was from the left, I would set 110. Or if I wanted it from the right, I would say 290. Rarely do you get a pure crosswind, so I'll put in 150. So a slight component from the left, headwind component, but mainly a left crosswind. And now you can set the speed in knots. I would suggest starting at a lower set of wind speeds and then build it up gradually in steps of 4 or 5 knots at a time. You also just want to set the gust conditions as well, and again start with no gusts and then perhaps build them up as you go. But if you don't want any gusts, set the gust speed to 0 and it will take it out. And then if you check up here, it will say winds ground, and then that's the winds as you would get it from ATIS or Tower 1507. Now you can, as a good idea, to actually save this. Now you go into the trouble of setting it up, and we can just click on that and it will give save it as a new preset, and it can be custom scattered clouds or whatever you want. You can now choose where you want to save them, locally or to Xbox Cloud Storage. Worth also mentioning that it's a good idea to change the time of day so you've got good visibility as well. It's also a good idea to set up your weight and balance for the aircraft now. The reason for doing it here rather than in the cockpit is that if you want to restart the flight, then you don't have to go through the process of resetting up the load for the aircraft each time. So we'll just select the aircraft here, select weight and balance. I'm not going to touch the fuel, but I'm going to set the aircraft up so it is a 6,000 pound aircraft. Now we can have a quick look and see what our centre of gravity is. 27.1 would be right in the centre of gravity, and we're at 29.2. So we're within limits, but a little bit aft of centre. So bear that in mind with your trim. And you can see 6,000 pounds. Before we get into the cockpit and start with our first practice crosswind takeoff, there are some things that you need to understand first about the forces that are acting on the aircraft in a crosswind. And there are 3 that you really need to consider. The first is weather vaning, the second is the effect of the crosswind on the wing lift on the wings and how that can affect them, and then finally the effect of using rudder, in fact the secondary effect of using rudder, which can also cause the wings to roll. So let's look at that. The first and most immediate force that you need to consider when you're on the ground is the effect of weather vaning. Now, when you're on the ground, the wheels are causing friction, static and rolling friction depending whether you're still or moving, and that tends to resist the effect of the wind to turn the aircraft. Now, in an aircraft like the Kodiak that has tricycle undercarriage, there is a pivot point, which is normally just around about where the main gear is, just maybe slightly forward of it, and the aircraft will want to turn around that pivot point. Now, there is a larger surface area, vertical surface area, to the aft of the pivot point. So when the wind is blowing and striking the side of the aircraft, because there's more surface area to the aft of that pivot point, that exerts a greater force. And because that force is greater than that forward of the pivot point, that means it will have the effect of pushing the tail of the aircraft more than it pushes the nose, which means the nose pivots and pivots into the wind. And this little diagram here helps illustrate what I'm talking about. So you can see the wind, that differential force, and how the nose will then turn. You can see here, greater surface area. The next thing we need to understand is the effect of the crosswind on lift on the wings. And simply put, the wing that is into the wind, upwind, that's going to generate more lift than the wing that's downlift, and that will have the tendency to tip the wing up and roll the aircraft. This does depend on things like the amount of dihedral of the wing, and the Kodiak does have a slight dihedral. You're going to be using the rudder to counteract the weather vaning effect, yawing the nose. So as you use the rudder though, it has a secondary effect, which is to then start to induce a roll. And so if we have the rudder deflected to the right, as we have at the minute, after a second or two, due to differential angle of attack, the left-hand wing will start to generate a bit more lift, and that will start to roll the aircraft. So that's enough theory for now. I'll hop into the cockpit, get the aircraft started up and taxi over to runway 20 right, where we'll look at our first takeoff. And when you're taxiing, remember to position your ailerons into the wind. So we know what the wind is going to be doing. It is 150 at 7 knots because we set it up that way. But what does that mean in terms of crosswind? And this is where we talk about the crosswind component or crosswind velocity. What is that? Well, that's the amount of the wind that is going to be directly affecting the aircraft. And if we have a look at this little diagram here, that shows what I'm talking about. So we have the wind 150 at 7, and you can see that splits into a crosswind and a headwind component. And using a calculator, that will tell us that we have a headwind of 4.5 knots and a crosswind from the left of 5.36. There are good online calculators that you can use. I'll leave a link in the description. There's also some mental arithmetic that you can use and rules of thumb that you can use to quickly work out, given a particular wind and direction, what size of crosswind you're going to be talking about. And again, I'll leave links to those in the description of the video. Okay, we've got all that information. We want to get on with a takeoff now, and we want to think about how we are going to best do that, what technique we're going to apply. Now we know that the wind is coming from the left, and we know that we will start to weather vane towards the wind, so the nose will start to turn to the left as we roll forward, and we need to counteract that with our rudder. And I've got the input viewer here ready to bring up. So we'll be using right rudder to counteract that. But we also know that the left wing in this high wing aircraft may start to lift up a bit, rolling the aircraft to the right. That is going to be exacerbated by that right hand rudder that we're using. So we're going to need to counter that, and we'll counter that by positioning the ailerons into the wind. Now in reality, you would start with the ailerons positioned fully into the wind, and that's because at slow speeds there's very little authority to be had from the ailerons. There needs to be air flowing over them before they start to gain any effect, and as you accelerate you then ease off on the aileron. Now Microsoft Flight Simulator, you may not need to go as far as that. Maybe something like that might do the trick, because there's certainly a risk if you start fully deflected and you don't ease off enough, then your rotation may not be very good. You'll start banking to the left, which you don't want to do in the Kodiak. So we can see what that is going to look like from the outside of the aircraft. So our rudder is going to be positioned to the right, and our ailerons positioned into the wind, and you can see that raises the aileron on the left wing, reducing the amount of lift it produces and preventing it from tilting up so much. Another consideration is, are you going to do a rolling takeoff, or are you going to set your power first, your takeoff torque, and then initiate the takeoff? Now in a strong wind, crosswind, you've got quite a lot to manage, as well as setting the correct takeoff torque and not wanting to over torque it. So it's normally quite a good idea to set the takeoff torque with the toe brakes engaged, and that's what we'll do for this takeoff. So we're releasing the parking brakes and applying the toe brakes. I'm going to set the takeoff torque power now, and I'll probably set it to around about 1500. There we go, that'll do. So I'm positioning my ailerons into the wind and releasing the toe brakes, and then using the rudder. There's 30 knots. Try and track that center line, 50 knots. Rotating at 60. There's a little bit of left wing dip. And as you take off, what you want to do is ease off on the rudder, and then if necessary just aim off to the left a little bit of the runway center line. That's called establishing the crab angle, and that way you can keep on tracking runway center line. And if you look at the MFD, you can see that I have stayed over the runway center line. And what if wind is a bit stronger? I've increased it up to 15 knots now, still the same direction and no gust. So it's going to be the same technique, except more so. So release the parking brakes, engage the toe brakes, set takeoff power. Now it's easy to forget if you're doing circuits to remain in the wrong flap or trim position, so you've always got to check before takeoff. So yep, I'm flaps 20 and the trim looks okay. So bring the torque up to 1500 again. Position our ailerons into the wind. Release the toe brakes and we immediately start vaning, so we'll correct that. Our speed's alive. There's a bit of a kick. There's 50 knots. 60, rotate. I'm going to ease off the rudder and establish the crab. And we've increased the wind speed to a very brisk 20 knots, and that is going to give us 15.5 knots of demonstrated crosswind, so right below that maximum value. We can see that the windsock there is well and truly inflated, and we'll see how we get on with this. This is probably going to be fairly tricky. So we're fully configured for takeoff, flaps 20, we are trimmed, and same procedure again. We're going to release the parking brake, engage the toe brakes, set our takeoff power. Always got to remember the lag that you get on a turboprop. Okay, that's close enough to 1500, so I'm going to start with the ailerons positioned into the wind, trying to release the toe brakes cleanly as possible, immediately start vaning, airspeed's alive, more rudder, keeping the wings level, there's 60 knots, rotating, there's a little bit of skipping there. And now ease off the rudder, establish the crab. And try and maintain center line. As you can see, I've actually drifted off from center line. Really does take quite a lot of crab to maintain the center line in a wind as strong as this, because as soon as you climb up as well, you can see from the wind vector the wind's getting stronger all the time. But as you can see, perfectly possible to take off in maximum demonstrated crosswind or close to with a 6,000 pound aircraft without any major dramas. What about landings in crosswind? That's where the real challenge comes in. It's certainly one of the hardest things that you can do in the Kodiak is get it down smoothly in a strong crosswind. Essentially, there are two types of crosswind landing technique. There's the first method, which is crab, and the second method is low wing. With crab, what you do is offset the angle of approach by flying an offset heading from the runway extended center line, and you do that in a way that keeps you aligned, not too much, not too little, correcting as you go. And you keep that all the way down until you're in the flare, at which point you kick in a bit of opposite rudder to get the nose aligned with the runway and then touch down. Low wing crosswind landing technique is the method favoured for general aviation aircraft, and it's the method I'll be showing in the landings I'll be doing now. It's very similar in nature to the takeoff technique. You're basically using a combination of rudder and aileron to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway but without rolling, and it's also known as a cross-controlled slip. You can break it into three phases. First of all, there is the approach, and that is when you begin two distinct phases, align with the rudder, and then use aileron to control that out and leave that upwind wing a little low. And then you maintain that all the way through until the touchdown. At the touchdown, you want to flare with the controls still crossed, bring the power to idle, and then carefully make sure that the wheels touch in the correct order. And that order is for the upwind main first, downwind main, then the nose. Once you've got all wheels down, then you begin the next phase, which is the rollout. The rollout's normally where it all goes horribly wrong. So the important thing to do is not to lose concentration and keep flying the aircraft. So once all three wheels are down, you're going to be maintaining the rudder pressure, increasing the aileron as you slow, but also getting that reverse thrust in. I find if you use rudder pedals, if you apply heavy braking while the aircraft's still moving quite fast, you're not likely to brake evenly, apply even brake pressure, and depending on how you've got your rudder pedals set up, how sensitive they are, you might find that really causes you to veer and potentially deviate from the runway. So I find it's better with the Kodiak just to use that powerful reverse thrust that you have, get the aircraft slowed down using that, and once you're at a slower speed, you can then start to apply braking. And also, when you are braking, you need to be very careful of a thing called the transfer of force. That as the brakes are applied, the inertia will carry forward, and if you're not perfectly aligned, there's a danger that you'll apply lateral forces on the nose wheel, and that will cause you to tip forward and end up with a prop strike and a wing strike. Generally, definitely better to save the heavy braking until you're going a bit slower, unless you're landing at a very short field. But then if you're landing at a very short field, should you be landing in a strong crosswind? And when you are braking, pull back on the elevator. That helps reduce the transfer of force. It also keeps much of the weight as possible off the nose wheel, which is an important consideration when certainly landing on a soft field. But it's good practice in all circumstances. So here we are in final for 7 runway 20 right. I'm at 88 knots. I've got right rudder pressure in, and with the left aileron it's the 7 knot crosswind. I'm just going to watch my speed, and I'm using the seam on the top of the engine to try and help maintain runway center line, and I'm looking at that and glancing at my speed and altimeter, looking at the aiming point. There we are over the threshold and bring the power back. There's the angle of attack indicator, keeping that rudder pressure on, just let the power drop. There we go. Now there wasn't much crosswind there, so I didn't really need to land with the left wing low, but we'll just bring it into reverse. Let it slow down, and now apply some braking. I'll just bring it to a stop there. So yeah, not much of a low wing required there, but just getting into the cross control position, and that combination of looking at the seam on the engine cowling, it's a good alignment tool along with the angle of attack indicator, and you just want to be glancing down at your airspeed and your radar altimeter as your sort of instrument scan just as you're coming into the flare, but all pretty smooth. So here we are now for 20 right again on a pretty extended final. The winds are up to 15 knots now. I think I'm seeing 3 red and 1 white on the Pappy, so I'm a little low. I'll just try and maintain level until I pick up the glide path, and as you can see there are definitely some gusts around. Well, there's 2 white and 2 red, you can just about make out with all that gusting going on, and that's probably due to thermals kicking off the buildings. So I'm losing my alignment now, so I'll go into a crab to try and get it lined up. Once it is lined up, I will go into the slip, so I'm putting in bags of right rudder to get the nose lined up and bringing in the aileron. Approach speed is good, 85 knots. Definitely don't want to land too slowly or get too slow in these kind of winds. So there we are, up to 4 white. Runway alignment is good, and you just got to ride through the bumps, keep working the controls. Speed has crept up quite a bit there. Going back in the power, maintaining the slip, smoothing out a bit now as I'm getting lower. Speed's a little high still. Maintaining the slip. Okay, we're over the threshold at 50 feet. Pulling back in the power. Getting our flare. Get that left wing low. And keep that aileron down. Keep flying. To reverse. That was beta and now reverse. That was just me easing off a little bit of pressure on the rudder there. That caused that little kick in the end. But that wasn't too bad. I landed well enough. I landed with the right wheel first, but I wasn't on centre line. I was in the at my aiming point though, so not too bad. So here I am on the downwind. Now we've cranked up the winds to 20 knots, and as you can see, I'm visibly tracking to the left. I've got quite a significant crab angle in to try and maintain my downwind. Probably a bit too much. You gotta be careful you don't overdo it. And we'll extend a bit, give ourselves plenty of time to get established. And in winds as strong as these and the expected gusting, I'm going to go for a flaps 20 landing. So there are the blimp hangars there. That's a good landmark for an extended landing. And so we'll turn the base now, and again keeping the turns to 20 degrees in these gusty conditions. If you get a gusty, you can easily tip the wing over into a much steeper bank than you want. Just watching my altitude and trying. It's the crosswinds effect. You know, I've got a strong headwind now, so that means I need to turn to base later than I normally would. And of course, when you do turn to base, it's if you're going to overshoot or undershoot, better to overshoot, because the drift will take you back down onto it. So there's 20 left now, or 20 right I should say. I'll maintain a crab, 100 knots. Looks like we've got 2 white, 2 red. So where head tracking is super useful. Just looking at the shape, need a bit more crab. When I get a bit closer, I will kick into the slip. The thing about the slip as well is it creates more drag, so your rate of descent will decrease, and that can be quite useful if you're wanting to lose height. Quite useful for bush strip landings where you've got a fairly short approach. Now I'm high and I'm a bit fast, so I'm going to pull back on the power. Okay. Right, now I'm going to come into the slip. Really trying to get that nose lined up. More rudder, more right rudder. Now I'm losing centre line. Trying to come it back in. Still quite fast. So 100 knots. 80 feet, 75. Keep that wing low. Pulling back on the power, keeping the wing low. Pitching up. Okay, back to right rudder. Keep that aileron down. Into reverse. Attempts braking now, nice and smooth. smooth. Oh, see, that's the tricky. See, that's the difficulty with braking. But because I was going slow enough, it didn't cause me any problem. Okay, that wasn't too bad considering. It was certainly quite challenging, but I did land it in the touchdown zone, a bit off centre line. But I landed with the gear in the right sequence, and it wasn't too hard a landing. What I would say is, when in conditions like this, do not try and grease your landings. Just get the aircraft down. If you try and smooth it, what will happen is the wind drift will get hold of you and start pushing you off to the side of the runway. And that happened to me a little bit there, but not too bad. Could be more critical on a narrower runway than this though. So just get the aircraft down. Don't worry too much about your landing rate as long as it's not a crash. So that concludes the tutorial on crosswind takeoff and landings today. I hope you found it useful. It's certainly quite a lot of fun making it, although quite a lot of effort as well. Do hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed it and find it valuable. I'm sorry about all the theory, but you kind of need to know it if you're going to understand what's happening to the aircraft. And without that understanding, it's hard to develop good practice and habits. So from a windy John Wayne airport, the Santa Ana winds are blowing hard. I'll say goodbye and see you in the next video.